Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Jackson, Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1842, when the peculiar case of Elijah Blackwood first caught the attention of the small but growing settlement of Jackson. Located in Hinds County, nestled along the Pearl River in the newly established state capital of Mississippi, Jackson was then a place of ambitious commerce and strict social hierarchies. The settlement had been named after General Andrew Jackson just 21 years prior, and was rapidly transforming from frontier outpost to proper southern city. What makes this case particularly unsettling isn't just what happened within the walls of the Blackwood estate on North State Street, but how it remained hidden in plain sight. For decades, the events surrounding the disappearance of Abigail Turner and the strange proclivities of her second husband, Elijah Blackwood, went unrecorded in official documents. It wasn't until 1862, when a collection of personal letters was discovered during renovations of the old Hinds County Courthouse, that the disturbing pattern began to emerge. According to these letters, exchanged between the former Sheriff Thomas Reynolds and his deputy William Hawkins, there had been considerable concern about Blackwood's activities. But as one letter dated November 12, 1843 states, "The matter of E. Blackwood must be handled with utmost discretion, given his standing with the governor and his considerable investments in the new railway." The documents suggest that Elijah Blackwood had acquired 3 wives over a 12-year period. Each marriage followed a peculiar pattern. Each bride was significantly younger than Blackwood himself. Each had previously been married, and each disappeared under circumstances that raised questions among neighbors but never resulted in formal investigation. But it was his acquisition of Abigail Turner that differed from the others in one crucial aspect. According to multiple accounts preserved in these letters, Abigail Turner had not been widowed when she became Blackwood's bride. Instead, witnesses claimed she had been transferred from one marriage to another through what one letter described as a most unusual arrangement between gentlemen. The spring of 1842 had been particularly wet in Mississippi. The Pearl River had swelled beyond its banks twice that season, leaving the roads between Jackson and the outlying plantations treacherously muddy. It was during this isolated time that Isaiah Turner, a struggling merchant who had moved to Jackson from Virginia just 2 years earlier, found himself increasingly unable to manage his mounting debts. Turner had established a modest dry goods store on Commerce Street, but the economic depression that had begun in 1837 still lingered throughout the nation. According to ledgers preserved in the state archives, Turner had borrowed heavily from several lenders, including Elijah Blackwood, who by then controlled significant banking interests in the region. Turner's wife, Abigail, was 21 years of age and had married him when she was just 18. According to church records from First Presbyterian Church, she was the daughter of a minister from Natchez who had died the previous year. Parish records described her as a woman of exceptional beauty and gentle temperament, well versed in scripture and music. What happened between the Turners during those rain-soaked spring months remains largely undocumented. But according to testimony from their housekeeper, Mary Sullivan, recorded years later in 1859, the household had grown increasingly tense. Mr. Turner took to drinking spirits before noon, she reported to a church elder who kept a personal journal of parish matters. The misses would often be heard weeping in the night. They spoke less and less as the weeks went on. On April 17, 1842, Isaiah Turner invited Elijah Blackwood to his home for what neighbors assumed was a business meeting. What transpired that evening has been pieced together from fragments the housekeeper's recollections, a brief mention in Blackwood's personal almanac found decades later, and rumors documented by the sheriff's correspondence. According to Mary Sullivan, the men sat in the study for 3 hours. They spoke in low voices, but I could hear the missus crying in the bedroom upstairs. Mr. Turner had instructed her to remain there until called for. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, Sullivan was asked to bring Abigail downstairs. She came down still in her day dress, her eyes red but her face composed. Mr. Blackwood stood when she entered. Mr. Turner did not. Sullivan was then dismissed for the evening, but through a partially open window, she claimed to have heard Turner say, "The arrangement is satisfactory. She will serve to cancel the debt in full." The next morning, Abigail Turner's belongings were loaded into Elijah Blackwood's carriage. According to Sullivan, Abigail did not speak a word during this process. She carried only a small Bible that had belonged to her father. Isaiah Turner remained in his study. By noon, Abigail had been installed at the Blackwood estate, approximately 3 miles north of town. What is particularly disturbing about this case is not just the apparent sale of a young woman to settle a debt, but the community's response to it. According to letters exchanged between prominent families, the incident was discussed in hushed tones, but rarely directly addressed. One letter from Elizabeth Montgomery to her sister in Mobile, dated May 3, 1842, notes, "The Turner affair has caused quite a stir, though one would never know it from public conversation. Mrs. Blackwood, as we must now call her, has not been seen at services nor in town since the arrangement was made." Isaiah Turner continued to operate his business for approximately 6 weeks after Abigail's departure. Records from the Bank of Mississippi show that his debts to Blackwood had indeed been marked as settled. Then, on June 2, 1842, Turner closed his shop, sold his remaining inventory to a competitor, and left Jackson. According to stagecoach manifests, he purchased passage to New Orleans. No further record of him has been found. Life at the Blackwood estate followed a predictable pattern in the weeks after Abigail's arrival. The household staff, consisting of 6 enslaved individuals and 2 white servants, maintained the property's immaculate appearance. Blackwood, who was 47 years old at the time, continued his regular business activities in town, serving on the bank's board of directors and attending meetings of the newly formed Chamber of Commerce. According to Martha Wilson, one of the house servants interviewed in 1868 by a journalist researching prominent Jackson families, Abigail was rarely seen outside her rooms during her first month at the estate. "Mrs. Blackwood took her meals alone," Wilson recalled. "The master instructed us never to enter her rooms without announcing ourselves first. She was often sitting by the window looking out toward town, her Bible in her lap. What few people knew at the time, though many would later speculate, was that Elijah Blackwood had established a pattern with his previous wives. According to county records, Blackwood had first married in 1830 when he was 35. His bride, Catherine Miller, was a 24-year-old widow. She died 18 months later of what the doctor recorded as female hysteria resulting in heart failure, a common but vague diagnosis of the era. Blackwood's second wife, Rebecca Holloway, another young widow, married him in 1834 and passed away in 1837 after falling down the main staircase of their home. In both cases, Blackwood had inherited substantial property through his marriages. Catherine had owned land near what would become Capitol Street, while Rebecca had brought a significant dowry from her wealthy plantation family. Each death had been investigated only cursorily, with the local doctor, who was known to be in considerable debt to Blackwood, signing the death certificates without performing thorough examinations. Abigail's position was different. She brought no wealth to the marriage, no property that could explain Blackwood's interest in her. According to Martha Wilson's account, the master would watch her at dinner, not speaking much, just watching. Sometimes he would ask her to play the pianoforte after the meal. She played beautifully, but never seemed to enjoy it. Her fingers would move, but her eyes stayed empty. By July of 1842, Abigail had begun to appear in public alongside her new husband. Church records show her attendance at services, though the minister's wife noted in her personal diary that Mrs. Blackwood appears greatly altered from her former self. She speaks only when directly addressed and keeps her gaze lowered. One cannot help but notice the substantial age difference between herself and Mr. Blackwood, who treats her with formal courtesy but little warmth. During this period, Jackson society gradually accepted the unusual circumstances of the new Mrs. Blackwood. The wealth and influence of Elijah Blackwood ensured that few questions were asked directly, though speculation continued behind closed doors. According to letters preserved from the period, Abigail was never fully embraced by the wives of other prominent businessmen, who found her distant and odd in her manners. What is particularly disturbing about the subsequent events is how Blackwood began to isolate his young wife. According to household accounts, by August, Abigail's activities were increasingly restricted. Martha Wilson reported that Mrs. Blackwood was no longer permitted to walk the grounds unaccompanied. The master said it was for her protection, but it seemed to us that she was becoming a prisoner in fine clothing. The first signs that something was deeply wrong came in September of that year. According to Dr. James Harrison's private medical journal, discovered in 1962 during the cataloguing of the State Medical Archives, he was called to the Blackwood estate on September 23rd to attend to Mrs. Blackwood, who was suffering from nervous exhaustion. His notes indicate that he found her extremely thin, with a vacant expression and trembling hands. More troublingly, he noted unusual bruising about the wrists and upper arms, consistent with forceful restraint. When he inquired about these marks, Blackwood explained that his wife had experienced episodes of hysteria, during which she had to be prevented from harming herself. Dr. Harrison prescribed a tonic and suggested fresh air and gentle exercise. However, he noted privately, "I find Mr. Blackwood's explanation unconvincing." The patient's eyes showed fear rather than confusion when her husband spoke. "I have seen such expressions before in situations I dare not commit to writing." October brought the first substantial rainfall since spring, and with it came a strange incident documented in Sheriff Reynolds' notes. On October 12th, a fisherman reported seeing a woman in a white nightgown standing in the rain near the Pearl River, approximately half a mile from the Blackwood property. When approached, the woman fled into the woods. A search was conducted, but no one was found. 3 days later, one of Blackwood's enslaved workers reported that Mrs. Blackwood had been confined to her bed with a fever. No connection between the incidents was officially established. By November, rumors about the Blackwood household had begun to circulate more widely. Martha Wilson recalled that Abigail had become so thin that her dresses had to be taken in several times. "She hardly spoke anymore, even to us servants," Wilson stated. "Sometimes I would bring her tea and find her staring at a small portrait she kept hidden in her Bible. A miniature of a young man I assumed was Mr. Turner." The situation reached a critical point in early December. According to Dr. Harrison's records, he was again summoned to the Blackwood estate on December 7th. This time, he found Abigail confined to her bed, unresponsive and feverish. His examination revealed what he described as evidence of deliberate malnutrition and possible poisoning. He noted that her symptoms were consistent with small doses of arsenic, a common component of many household items of the era, including certain cosmetics and rat poisons. When confronted with this possibility, Blackwood became hostile and dismissed the doctor, claiming he would seek a second opinion from a physician in Vicksburg. No record exists of another doctor visiting the estate. What happened next represents one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. On December 12th, Martha Wilson reported that she was instructed to prepare the guest bedroom for a visitor. That evening, a man arrived in a covered carriage. He was shown directly to Elijah Blackwood's study. According to Wilson, they spoke for hours. I could not hear what was said, but twice I heard Mrs. Blackwood's name mentioned. The next morning, Abigail was seen being helped into the same carriage by Blackwood and the visitor, whose face remained largely concealed. According to Wilson's testimony, Mrs. Blackwood could barely walk. She was wrapped in a heavy traveling cloak despite the mild day. Her face was the color of ash. She looked at me as they led her past, and I will never forget her eyes. They were the eyes of someone already dead. The carriage departed in the direction of Natchez. 3 days later, Elijah Blackwood announced to his household that his wife had been taken to her family connections in Natchez due to her declining health. However, church records in Natchez show no evidence of Abigail's arrival, and inquiries made years later confirmed that she had no living relatives there. Elijah Blackwood continued his life in Jackson as if nothing unusual had occurred. By February of 1843, he had resumed his regular social activities. When asked about his wife, he would reply simply that she was recovering with family and changed the subject. As months passed, these inquiries became less frequent. By summer, it seemed that Abigail Turner Blackwood had been all but forgotten by Jackson society. The true fate of Abigail might have remained unknown were it not for a chance discovery made in 1865. During the Union occupation of Jackson following the Civil War, a federal officer named Captain Robert Weldon was assigned quarters in what had been the Blackwood estate, Elijah Blackwood having died in 1857. While inspecting the property, Weldon discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of what had been Blackwood's study. Inside was a small lockbox containing several items: a leather-bound journal, a collection of letters, and a woman's gold wedding band with the initials A.T. engraved inside. The journal, written in Blackwood's hand, contained entries dating from 1830 to 1856. The contents of this journal revealed the disturbing truth behind Elijah Blackwood's marriages. According to his own writings, Blackwood had developed what he called a methodology for acquisition and disposal. He described in clinical detail how he identified potential wives, how he engineered situations that placed them in vulnerable positions, and how he eventually eliminated them once they no longer served his purposes. Most disturbing were his entries regarding Abigail. He wrote on April 20th, 1842, "Turner proved more amenable to arrangement than anticipated. The debt of $3,000 was sufficient leverage. His character is weak, his affection for her insufficient against financial ruin. The acquisition was completed with minimal resistance from either party. A is younger than preferred, but her demeanor suggests suitable malleability. Later entries documented his systematic breaking of Abigail's will through isolation, psychological manipulation, and gradually increased doses of arsenic in her food. By December, he noted, subject has become unresponsive to stimulus and shows signs of permanent damage. Value diminished beyond recovery. Contacted J. Regarding disposal, the J referenced is believed to be Jonathan Graves, a physician known to have operated a private asylum near Natchez. Records from this asylum, incomplete though they are, include an entry for December 14, 1842, listing a new patient identified only as A.B., described as suffering from acute melancholia and delusions. The entry noted that the patient was not expected to survive the winter. No death certificate for Abigail was ever filed. No grave marker bears her name. The last trace of her existence is an entry in Dr. Graves's ledger from February 18, 1843, simply stating, A.B. deceased, remains handled as per private arrangement. The discovery of Blackwood's journal led to a belated investigation into his other wives' deaths. Exhumation of Catherine Miller. Blackwood's remains in 1866 revealed high levels of arsenic. Rebecca Holloway. Blackwood's body showed evidence of a broken neck, but also indicated significant arsenic presence, suggesting her fall may have been preceded by systematic poisoning. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that Elijah Blackwood had begun corresponding with another widow just 3 months before his own death from apoplexy in 1857. His final journal entry, dated 2 weeks before his death, read, "Have made initial inquiries regarding Mrs. L.S. widowed 8 months. Property on South Street valued at $8,000. Initial meeting arranged for next Wednesday." The Blackwood case represents a particularly disturbing example of how wealth and social position could shield the most heinous crimes from scrutiny. While Isaiah Turner's sale of his young wife was itself a profound violation, what followed at the hands of Elijah Blackwood reveals a calculated pattern of predation that went unaddressed for decades. The Blackwood estate remained standing until 1923, when it was demolished to make way for commercial development. Workers reported finding numerous strange items during the demolition, including a small room in the basement with peculiar restraints attached to the walls. These findings were documented by the foreman, but subsequently disappeared from public records. Today, the location where the Blackwood home once stood is occupied by a modern office building. Employees have occasionally reported unexplained cold spots and the sound of a woman crying. Security guards working night shifts have described the impression of being watched from empty rooms. One guard, who resigned after just 3 weeks of employment in 1968, stated in his exit interview, "Something in that building remembers what happened there." The case of Elijah Blackwood and Abigail Turner serves as a dark reminder of justice delayed and ultimately denied. While historical records preserved fragments of their story, much remains unknown. Did Isaiah Turner ever attempt to learn what became of the young wife he had essentially sold? Did anyone in Jackson society suspect the true nature of what transpired behind the imposing doors of the Blackwood estate? And what became of Abigail's remains after her death in that distant asylum? Some questions will never be answered. In 1868, a fire at the Hinds County Records Office destroyed many of the documents relating to property transactions and marriages from the 1840s. The asylum where Abigail is believed to have died was abandoned after the Civil War, its records scattered and largely lost. Time has erased many traces of this disturbing chapter in Jackson's history. Yet sometimes, history refuses to remain buried. In 1952, during excavation for a water main near the former site of the Blackwood property, workers uncovered a small tin box containing a woman's Bible. Inside the cover was inscribed, "To my beloved daughter Abigail, may the Lord's word be your comfort and guide. Father." Pressed between its pages was a dried flower and a small piece of paper bearing only the words, "Remember me." The Bible now resides in the Mississippi State Archives, a silent testament to a young woman who was treated as property, passed from one owner to another, and ultimately discarded when she no longer served her purpose. It stands as evidence of a crime that went unpunished, in a time when such transactions could occur with minimal comment or consequence. The shadows cast by the Blackwood case are long indeed. They remind us that some of the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary men whose actions are sheltered by wealth, position, and a society willing to look the other way. They teach us that true horror often lies not in what is seen, but in what remains carefully hidden, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, finds ways to make itself known. Visitors to modern-day Jackson may walk past the site where these events unfolded without ever knowing its dark history. The buildings have changed, the streets have been widened, and few visible reminders exist of the Blackwood estate or its unfortunate inhabitants. Yet in archives and forgotten records, in family stories passed down through generations, and perhaps in the very soil of the place, the echoes of this tragedy remain. For those who investigate historical crimes, the case of Elijah Blackwood stands as a warning about the incomplete nature of history, how much can be lost, hidden, or deliberately obscured. It teaches us to look beyond official records to the quiet spaces where truth often resides, in personal letters, in journals, in the testimonies of those whose voices were rarely heard in their own time. And it raises disturbing questions about how many similar cases might have occurred, their details lost to history or deliberately concealed. How many other Abigails might have existed, their stories never told, their fates never questioned. In the antebellum South, where human beings could legally be bought and sold, how thin was the line between that sanctioned commerce and the unsanctioned disposal of unwanted wives? Perhaps most disturbingly, the case suggests that the formal end of such practices did not necessarily mean their complete disappearance. The commodification of human life takes many forms across time, and the powerful have always found ways to acquire what they desire without consequence. Today, the Mississippi Archives continues to receive occasional inquiries about the Blackwood case from historians and criminologists studying patterns of domestic violence in the 19th century. The journal discovered by Captain Weldon has been preserved and digitized, though access is restricted due to the disturbing nature of its contents. As for Isaiah Turner, the man who sold his young wife to cancel a debt, historical records offer little closure. Passenger manifests confirm his arrival in New Orleans in June of 1842, but beyond that, he seems to have vanished from official documentation. According to one unverified account from 1849, a man matching Turner's description was encountered in a San Francisco boarding house during the early days of the gold rush. The witness, a former Jackson resident, claimed that when he mentioned Mississippi, the man became visibly agitated and left the establishment immediately. Did Turner flee west to escape his guilt? Did he attempt to rebuild his life with the burden of what he had done? Or did Elijah Blackwood, methodical as he was in all things, ensure that no witnesses to his arrangement would remain to question it? Like so many aspects of this case, we may never know the full truth. The story of Elijah Blackwood and Abigail Turner remains a troubling chapter in the history of Jackson, Mississippi. A reminder that behind the stately facades of antebellum homes and beneath the polite conversations of society, darkness could flourish unchecked. It stands as testament to how systems of power could enable predatory behavior and how easily the vulnerable could disappear when they became inconvenient. For those who study such historical cases, perhaps the most important legacy is not just knowledge of what happened, but a commitment to ensuring such silences are harder to maintain in our own time. The true horror of the Blackwood case lies not just in what was done, but in how easily it was concealed and how many others might have shared Abigail's fate, their stories still waiting to be discovered in forgotten letters, overlooked records, or beneath the foundations of buildings that have long since replaced the scenes of their suffering. In the whisper of wind, through Jackson's old oak trees, in the shadows that gather at twilight along the Pearl River, perhaps something of Abigail Turner remains. Not a supernatural presence, but the persistent memory of injustice that refuses to be forgotten. And in the careful preservation of what evidence survives in the telling and retelling of her story, there exists a form of belated witness to a life that others tried to erase. The case files remain open, the questions linger, and somewhere, in archives yet unexplored or documents still hidden, further pieces of this dark puzzle may wait to be discovered, offering, if not justice, then at least acknowledgement of what was done to a young woman whose only crime was to be valuable to men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be traded. In 1959, nearly a century after these events, A history professor at Millsaps College named Dr. Eleanor Whitfield began researching what she called hidden crimes of the antebellum South. Her focus was not on the broader, institutionalized violence of slavery, which had received significant scholarly attention, but on the more intimate crimes that occurred within households and families. Dr. Whitfield's interest in the Blackwood case began when she discovered a reference to it in the diary of Elizabeth Montgomery, a prominent Jackson socialite from the 1840s. The brief mention, "One shudders to think what truly became of the Turner woman in that house," led Whitfield to search for additional sources. Through painstaking research in county records, church archives, and private collections, Dr. Whitfield gradually assembled a more complete picture of what had occurred. She tracked down Martha Wilson's descendants and found that the family had preserved oral histories about the wicked master and the poor young missus who never smiled. In a leather-bound portfolio discovered in the attic of the former sheriff's grandson, Dr. Whitfield found additional correspondence that shed light on why no official investigation had ever been conducted. According to these letters, Elijah Blackwood had made substantial loans to both Sheriff Reynolds and the county judge. Moreover, he had knowledge of financial irregularities in the county's administration that, if revealed, would have resulted in criminal charges against several officials. The conspiracy of silence that protected Blackwood was not merely social, but institutional, Dr. Whitfield wrote in her unpublished manuscript. Those with the authority to investigate were themselves compromised, creating a perfect environment for predation. Perhaps the most significant discovery came in 1962, when Dr. Whitfield followed a lead to a small private cemetery outside Natchez. There, behind the ruins of what had once been Dr. Graves's asylum, she found a section of unmarked graves. Records indicated that between 1840 and 1855, 63 patients had been interred in this potter's field. Working with a forensic anthropologist from the University of Mississippi, Dr. Whitfield obtained permission to examine several of these graves. In one, corresponding to the approximate time of A.B.'s recorded death, they found the remains of a female estimated to be in her early 20s. Analysis revealed significant levels of arsenic in the preserved hair samples, levels consistent with long-term poisoning rather than a single lethal dose. Among the few personal items recovered from this grave was a small silver thimble engraved with the letter A. According to church records from First Presbyterian in Jackson, Abigail Turner had been known for her fine needlework before her marriage to Isaiah Turner. Dr. Whitfield's research took an unexpected turn when she began receiving anonymous letters warning her to abandon her investigation. One such letter, postmarked from New Orleans, stated simply, "Some family histories should remain buried. You are disturbing powers you do not understand." Despite these warnings, Dr. Whitfield continued her work. In April of 1963, she traveled to New Orleans to examine records that might reveal what became of Isaiah Turner after his arrival there. According to her research notes, she had arranged to meet with a librarian at the Louisiana Historical Society who claimed to have found Turner's name in the membership rolls of a peculiar society called the Pearl Merchants. Dr. Whitfield never returned from this trip. According to police reports, she checked into the Monteleone Hotel on April 17th, but never checked out. Her room was found undisturbed, with her notes and personal items still in place. The only item missing was her research portfolio on the Blackwood case. The New Orleans Police Department conducted a cursory investigation, concluding that Dr. Whitfield had likely left voluntarily, perhaps due to personal reasons or mental strain. The case was classified as a missing person rather than a suspected crime, despite protests from her colleagues at Millsaps College. Dr. Whitfield's disappearance might have been forgotten entirely if not for a package received by the Mississippi State Archives in 1968. The package, sent anonymously from a post office in Baton Rouge, contained photocopies of much of Dr. Whitfield's research, along with a handwritten note that read, "This work cost Eleanor her life. See that it was not in vain." Among these papers was evidence suggesting a disturbing possibility that Isaiah Turner had not simply abandoned Abigail to her fate. Dr. Whitfield had discovered an entry in the journal of a Methodist circuit rider who had passed through Jackson in February of 1843. The preacher recorded a strange conversation with a man he encountered on the road south of town. "Met a haggard gentleman who asked if I had come from Natchez. When I answered in the affirmative, he inquired whether I had heard of a young woman recently deceased at a private asylum there. I told him I had not. He then asked if I knew of Dr. Graves and his establishment. I said the doctor's reputation was known to me, though not favorably. At this, the man became greatly agitated, saying repeatedly, 'Then it is true. He has done it.' When I asked who he meant, he replied, 'Blackwood. He has killed her, as he killed the others.' The man then hurried away before I could learn more of this troubling accusation. This account suggests that Isaiah Turner may have learned of Abigail's fate and perhaps even returned to Jackson, consumed by guilt or seeking confirmation of what he feared had happened to the wife he had sold. Further evidence came from an unexpected source. In the records of the Western State Lunatic Asylum in Mississippi, Dr. Whitfield had found an admission record from June of 1843 for a patient identified only as I.T., a male, 34 years of age, admitted for acute melancholia and dangerous ideation. The admitting physician noted, "Patient repeats constantly that he sold her to the devil and expresses intent to commit violence against a prominent citizen of J." The patient remained institutionalized for 11 years, eventually dying of tuberculosis in 1854. His personal effects, listed in the asylum's records, included a daguerreotype of a young woman and a torn page from a Bible with the inscription, "To my beloved daughter Abigail." These discoveries suggest a narrative far more complex than a simple transaction between men. Isaiah Turner, having sold his wife to cancel a debt, apparently came to regret his decision profoundly. Whether this regret stemmed from learning of Blackwood's true nature, from genuine affection for Abigail, or simply from his own guilty conscience, remains unknown. But it appears he did not simply abandon her memory and move on with his life, as was long assumed. What is clear, however, is that his remorse came too late for Abigail. By the time Turner began to understand the consequences of his action, she was already trapped in Blackwood's methodical process of destruction, a process that had claimed at least 2 lives before hers, and might have claimed more had Blackwood lived longer. The Blackwood case takes on additional significance when viewed in the context of its era. The 1840s in America saw the beginning of organized advocacy for women's rights, culminating in the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Yet while educated women in the Northeast were beginning to challenge their legal status as essentially the property of their husbands, women like Abigail Turner remained fully subject to a system that afforded them few protections and fewer rights. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, which prevailed throughout America at that time, a married woman had no separate legal existence from her husband. She could not own property in her own name, sign contracts, or control her own earnings. More crucially, in Abigail's case, she could not refuse if her husband decided to transfer her to another man. While the specific arrangement between Turner and Blackwood, essentially selling a wife to cancel a debt, might have raised eyebrows even in 1840s Mississippi, it violated no specific law. Abigail had no legal right to refuse. Once she became Blackwood's wife, through whatever arrangement had been made, she was equally powerless in her new situation. This legal and social reality forms the true horror at the heart of the Blackwood case. Not just that one man was willing to trade a human being to avoid financial ruin, or that another saw women as collectible commodities to be acquired and disposed of, but that the entire system was structured to enable such transactions. The story of Elijah Blackwood and his victims remained largely forgotten until 1972. When historian Margaret Calhoun included it in her groundbreaking work, Silent Suffering: Crimes Against Women in the Old South. Calhoun had accessed the materials sent to the Mississippi archives after Dr. Whitfield's disappearance, as well as additional sources that had come to light in the intervening years. Calhoun's work brought new attention to the case, placing it within the broader context of how legal and social structures enabled violence against women. She particularly emphasized the economic aspects of the case, how Blackwood used financial leverage not only to acquire Abigail from Isaiah Turner, but to ensure that local officials turned a blind eye to his activities. In examining the Blackwood case, Calhoun wrote, we see how wealth functioned not merely as a shield against consequences, but as a weapon used to create victims. Through strategic loans and financial entanglements, Blackwood effectively purchased both his wives and immunity from scrutiny. In 1987, during renovations of the building now standing on the former Blackwood property, workers discovered a small hidden space beneath what would have been the main staircase of the original house. Inside was a metal box containing several items: a woman's hairbrush with strands of auburn hair still entangled in the bristles, a small diary with most pages torn out, and a folded piece of paper bearing what appeared to be a list of names and dates. The list, examined by experts from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, contained 5 women's names. 3 were identifiable as Blackwood's known wives: Catherine, Rebecca, and Abigail. The remaining 2 names, Sarah Winters and Louise Chamberlain, have never been conclusively connected to Blackwood, raising the disturbing possibility that his pattern of predation may have extended beyond his marriages. Next to each name was a date and a notation. Catherine, acquired Oct. 1830, disposed Feb. 1832. Illness. Rebecca, acquired Mar. 1834, disposed Nov. 1837. Accident. Abigail, acquired Apar. 1842, disposed Dec. 1842. Transfer. The notations for the other 2 names followed the same pattern, with Sarah Winters acquired in 1828 and disposed in 1829, and Louise Chamberlain acquired in 1838, but with no disposal date listed. Attempts to identify these women in historical records have yielded limited results. As Sarah Winters appears in the 1825 census for Adams County, Mississippi, listed as a 20-year-old woman living in the household of an older couple presumed to be her parents. By the 1830 census, she no longer appears in their household, nor anywhere else in Mississippi records. Louise Chamberlain has proven even more elusive. The name appears in a passenger manifest for a steamboat traveling from New Orleans to Memphis in July of 1838, but no further trace of her has been found. These fragments suggest that Blackwood's pattern of predation may have begun earlier and extended more broadly than previously known. If Sarah Winters was indeed an early victim, she predates Blackwood's first known marriage. And if Louise Chamberlain was another victim who somehow escaped being disposed of, she represents a potentially crucial missing piece in understanding how Blackwood operated. The disturbing possibility exists that Blackwood maintained connections with other men who shared his proclivities. The reference to Abigail's transfer, rather than illness or accident, suggests that she may have been passed to yet another predator, rather than simply killed when she became too damaged to be of interest to Blackwood. The involvement of Dr. Graves, who operated an asylum where unwanted wives could conveniently die of melancholia, points to a network rather than a lone actor. Dr. Whitfield's research notes, recovered after her disappearance, contain references to what she termed a circle of collectors, wealthy men in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, who may have engaged in similar practices. She had identified several cases with patterns reminiscent of the Blackwood case. Young women married to much older, wealthy men, often as second or third wives, who subsequently died under ambiguous circumstances or simply disappeared. Most disturbing was her discovery of correspondence between Elijah Blackwood and a New Orleans businessman named Richard Delacroix, dating from 1841. In one letter, Delacroix wrote, "I find your methodology most efficient. My own collection has grown to 4, though I have encountered difficulties with disposal that you seem to have solved admirably. I would be most interested in learning more about your arrangement with Dr. And G. The possibility that Blackwood was not an isolated case, but part of a network of predators, adds another dimension of horror to an already disturbing story. It suggests organized, systematic victimization rather than the actions of a single disturbed individual. This aspect of the case may explain the warnings received by Dr. Whitfield and potentially her disappearance. If descendants of these collectors still held positions of influence in the 1960s, they would have had strong motivation to prevent exposure of their family histories. The last significant development in the Blackwood case came in 1995, when an elderly woman named Frances Wilson contacted the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. She identified herself as the great-granddaughter of Martha Wilson, the house servant who had worked in the Blackwood household during Abigail's brief residency there. Frances Wilson had in her possession a small leather pouch that had been passed down through generations of her family. According to family tradition, Martha Wilson had found the pouch hidden beneath a floorboard in Abigail's room after her removal from the house. Rather than turning it over to Blackwood, Martha had kept it, sensing that it contained something Abigail had wanted preserved. Inside the pouch was a folded piece of paper containing what appeared to be a letter never sent. Written in a delicate but increasingly unsteady hand, it read, "Isaiah, if this should ever reach you, know that I forgive you. What was done cannot be undone, but I understand the desperation that drove you to it. I write this knowing that my time grows short. He put something in my food. I taste it now and try to eat as little as possible, but grow weaker each day. He watches me always, measuring my decline with those cold eyes. There is a doctor who comes sometimes, but he is not here to heal. They speak of taking me away soon, to a place from which I believe I shall never return. I am not afraid of death, but I am afraid of being forgotten. Remember me, Isaiah. Remember that I loved you once before fear and debt came between us. And if there is justice in this world or the next, remember that Elijah Blackwood must answer for what he has done, not just to me, but to others before me. I have heard the servants whisper of Catherine and Rebecca. I fear I shall be joining them soon. Remember me. Abigail." This final communication from Abigail Turner Blackwood, never delivered, hidden away for over 150 years, provides the only direct testimony from any of Blackwood's victims. It confirms much of what had been pieced together from other sources while adding a human dimension often missing from historical accounts. Particularly striking is Abigail's forgiveness of the husband who essentially sold her, contrasted with her clear-eyed assessment of Blackwood as a deliberate, methodical killer. Her awareness of his previous victims suggests she had managed to gather information despite her isolation, perhaps through interactions with the household staff. Today, visitors to Jackson will find no official markers or memorials acknowledging Elijah Blackwood or his victims. The sites where these events occurred have been built over multiple times as the city has grown and changed. Yet the story persists, passed down through historical accounts, academic studies, and the oral traditions of families connected to the case. In 2003, a small private ceremony was held at the Mississippi State Archives, where Abigail's Bible and her unsent letter are now preserved. Attended by historians, archivists, and descendants of Martha Wilson, the ceremony was described by one participant as a belated act of witness for a woman whose suffering had gone unacknowledged in her own time. The ceremony included the dedication of a small plaque that now accompanies the display of Abigail's Bible. It reads simply, "In memory of Abigail Turner Blackwood, 1821-1843, and all whose stories remain untold." The case of Elijah Blackwood and Abigail Turner offers no neat conclusions, no satisfying justice, no moment when evil is definitively punished. It remains, like many historical crimes, unresolved in many of its details and unavenged in any meaningful sense. What it does offer is a window into a particular form of horror that flourished in the spaces created by legal, social, and economic structures that rendered certain people, especially women, vulnerable to exploitation and violence. It reminds us that monsters need not be supernatural to inspire terror. They need only the power to act with impunity and a society willing to look away. In the whispered stories still told about the Blackwood case, in the academic papers that continue to analyze its significance, and in the preserved fragments of evidence that survived attempts to erase it from history, there exists a form of reckoning. Not justice, it is far too late for that, but acknowledgement. For Abigail Turner, sold by one husband to another who systematically destroyed her, that acknowledgement comes more than 180 years too late. Yet in remembering her story, in refusing to let it disappear entirely from history, perhaps we honor her final request, written in that never-delivered letter, "Remember me." And in that remembrance lies a kind of power, not to change the past, but to recognize how its shadows continue to shape our present and to remain vigilant against the conditions that allow such shadows to deepen.